PlayStation has been around for well over 30 years, and they still haven't picked a mascot. Nintendo has Mario, Xbox has Master Chief, and even Hamburger Helper has the goddamn glove. Just pick one! Now, I'm a Nintendo guy. I'm not beating the allegations, but I play a lot of games. I beat Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights. If that's not a real game, I don't know what is. But out of all of the game characters out there, only some get to be a mascot. Like them or not, mascots used to be pretty important. You think they made the Mucinex guy for the love of the game? No, they just want to sell you something. They help personify a brand so you can immediately know what they're about. They don't have to be deep or well written, just recognizable. But in video games, mascots are a bit different. These guys stick around for years and sometimes even decades because they become tied directly to the identity of the platform. You don't even really think about it anymore. You can just see the character and instantly know the company behind it. When you see a Mario game, you know it's gonna sell a ton of copies. I mean, how often are people going out and buying a tennis game without this fat Italian on the cover? But more than that, you get to see how gaming has evolved over time. Even take Halo, starting with Combat Evolved and going to Infinite, you can clearly see the progress the series has made. Now, PlayStation has this, but they just keep losing their goddamn franchises. And I'm not just talking about the rights to them, I'm convinced they lost Parappa the Rappa and they're ashamed to admit it. But I want to know who their mascot is. So I'm gonna look at all of the various contenders throughout history and pick for myself, starting with the PlayStation 1. Sorry, I didn't have a plate. The PlayStation was a great console, so good in fact, it helped plot the assassination of Sega. You know, alongside Sega themselves. This thing sold insanely well, and it had some incredible games to boot. But when this launched, Sony already knew that mascots mattered. After Mario and Sonic exploded in popularity, every company on Earth wanted their own little guy to take the spotlight. It didn't even matter what your company did, they just wanted a little guy to dance around in a commercial. So Sony was in a weird position because unlike Nintendo and Sega, they were starting from scratch. So instead of building the brand around a character, they built the PlayStation 1 around having a attitude problem. The entire brand image of this console was child of divorce. They were one Mountain Dew away from encouraging a domestic dispute. I was sold. Now, they were speaking my language. It was edgy, loud, and rebellious for no good reason. While Nintendo was more family-friendly, Sony and Sega were both trying to be the cool guys, which led PlayStation into creating one of the strongest mascot lineups of all time. You had Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Ape Escape, Medieval, and even weird stuff like Parappa the Rappa, who at the time wasn't missing. They were all mascot material, but the biggest contender by far was Crash Bandicoot. They were pushing Crash hard. Commercials, magazines, even the demo kiosks had this orange everywhere. And for the time, Crash worked perfectly. He was loud, expressive, and chaotic, which was basically the exact energy that they were trying to sell. The problem was that Sony never actually owned him. Crash was owned by Universal, meaning Sony was basically renting their mascot, Genius. And it wasn't just Crash either. Spyro, Tomb Raider, and Final Fantasy all belonged to different companies. So Sony had a great platform, but that was about it. It didn't end up mattering very much because the console itself sold over 100 million units, and I would say that was pretty successful and definitely enough to carry them into a successor. But when the PlayStation 2 released, things changed. It went on to be the best-selling video game console ever, mostly because Sony somehow keeps finding more they allegedly sold. But I bought a Wii U, so what do I know about sales? This was the generation where Sony got the closest to solving their mascot problem. Because the PlayStation 2 was overflowing with as many iconic characters and franchises as you can think of. Gaming was simpler back then. There wasn't really a right or wrong because anything and everything was becoming a game. Now this did lead to a lot of weird ones, but still, out of all of the different types of games, the most important were the action games and platformers. The hardware had gotten strong enough for developers to create bigger worlds and add voice acting, so games got more cinematic because of it. And the PlayStation 2 had so many highly recognizable characters, with the best examples being Jak and Daxter, Ratchet & Clank, and Sly Cooper. Now you might be thinking, we finally found it, there's the mascot. Are you insane? They're all dead. Sony, baby, listen. I love the modern cinematic games you're going for recently. The stories are great. But what the happened to all of the other games you own? And these three were just the tip of the iceberg, because there is a huge list of games that they are sitting on for reasons I don't fully understand. Jak and Daxter is one of the best examples of games from this time. The original game was a really cartoony collectathon heavily inspired by other platformers like Banjo-Kazooie. So they laid a foundation, and then they decided to just not do that anymore. Jak 2 and 3 were a lot darker and edgier than the original. I get it, things change. But why? This was during the great shift towards realistic graphics and open worlds, so I see how they got there, but this was a jump. All three of these games were great, but Jak was the perfect representation of the direction that PlayStation itself was moving during this time. There was also Ratchet & Clank, who thankfully are still getting games, but they represented a very different side of PlayStation, especially at the time. While Jak became darker and more story-driven over time, Ratchet & Clank leaned more into humor, action, and general weirdness. This series is phenomenal, and if there was one mascot during this time, it was these two. They also made a full movie. They want you to forget about it, but I won't. Like I said, Ratchet & Clank are still getting games as recently as 2021 for the PlayStation 5, so for that, I'm thankful. Because they easily could have ended up like Sly Cooper. Instead of focusing on flashy gameplay and combat, Sly Cooper went for a stealth-based cartoonish game. Now compared to the other two, this was slower and not the most popular of the three, but it filled a different role. There were stealth games on the market, sure, but none of them look like this, and I like it. Back in the day, there was no question that these were the big three. But there was one more series that got its start on this console, and that was God of War. I even have this sealed demo disc that I just want to show off. If Jak and Daxter was the first step towards a more serious game, God of War was their first felony. It was just brutality and yelling. Playing this and drinking Monster energy drinks were the most masculine things you could do in 2005. This was focused very heavily on the spectacle. Everything from finishing off enemies in combat to the quick time events were designed to keep your attention and give you nightmares. This game and the other popular titles at the time pushed PlayStation over the edge. On one side, they still had the colorful, mascot-driven franchises like Ratchet & Clank, but on the other, they had the brutal, more cinematic games that appealed to older audiences. And that balance is what made the PlayStation 2 era so interesting. The console had a wild amount of variety, which we don't really see anymore. So you would think with all that variety, they would finally land on a mascot. The PlayStation 3 was a console that was pretty f***ing expensive, but outside of that, it was great. Not having to deal with memory cards, HD gameplay, and online play with no fee were more than enough reasons to upgrade. Now during this era, PlayStation, along with a majority of the gaming industry, shifted heavily toward realism. You know, just like real life, where everything is gritty and colorless. Now this was also the time where we saw the second major console war begin. The Xbox 360 had been on the market for about a year, and it had most of the same features the PS3 did, and for a fraction of the cost. Luckily, PlayStation had all of those exclusive franchises that had a huge fan base that they were going to make games for. Psych, you thought, look how stupid you look. New games for a new console was the status quo. Now in my opinion, it would have been a good idea to continue the series they had built on their last console, but what do I know? Of course, Ratchet & Clank continued on the PS3, getting multiple games, but it didn't keep that same steam going that it used to have. The industry as a whole shifted away from the cartoony, crude humor the series was known for. And since they made so many games in such a short time, I get why most people got burnout. Sly Cooper got a new game too, but it got passed over to a different developer. The game itself was fine. I don't think it was the best in the series, but at least they gave it a game. They just took Jak and Daxter outside and shot it in the face. Being totally honest, it makes sense that these series were dying off. This was the first time we were able to see games that looked this real. And the last few consoles were full of this style, so it made sense that people were ready for a change. But that paved the way for a new era of games, where someone could be the mascot. We all know where this was going. While PlayStation had plenty of exclusives during this generation, most of them were games that were licensed, not that they owned. Sony's biggest exclusives became these more cinematic, realistic, and story-driven adventures like Uncharted. There were 3 titles released here, starting with Drake's Fortune that was good, but then the series became a blockbuster with Uncharted 2. The series was made by Naughty Dog, the same developers as Jak and Daxter, and you could tell this was the direction they wanted to go for Jak's later games. But this was an absolute hit. Like God of War did, this franchise pushed PlayStation in the direction they've been going in the modern day, which they only further cemented with The Last of Us. Now, this released in 2013 near the very end of the console's lifespan, and it only got 1 game here. But it also became one of the most critically acclaimed games ever. Now, even though he's just a guy, I thought that Joel would end up being their mascot. But I don't think that's gonna happen anymore. Because it got released so late in the PS3's life, it didn't define the console era like Uncharted did. It more so felt like a preview of what PlayStation's future would look like in the next gen, which ended up being very accurate. But the series that was really pushing for the mascot title during this time was a bit different. Little Big Planet introduced us to Sackboy, which sounds like a name pulled from Jeffrey Epstein's laptop. But outside of its unfortunate name, it was also the biggest contender for PlayStation's mascot. It had the simple design and charm needed for a mascot, but Little Big Planet never got the same appeal that other series did. This is my favorite PlayStation series. The online play alone made this infinitely replayable, until they pulled the plug on it. But it was more of a creative platform rather than a central identity of what PlayStation had become. Now, there were other series at the time that PlayStation had, like Infamous, God of War, Killzone, and more, that were all notable. I like Infamous more than most people, definitely more than Sony does, but during the PS3 era, they never had the same appeal as the big guys. Because this generation's big characters looked very different than the last ones did. Of course, the exclusives were important, but this generation was more carried by the big cross-console games with online experiences that took the world by storm. Now, playing online taught me a lot. Mostly a list of words I'm not allowed to say. And that did not get any better on the PS4. Unlike the PlayStation 3, the PS4 released at a reasonable price point. It had a huge jump in graphics, better online features like party chat, and a controller that I don't hate. For most of the generation, the 360 was dominating the PS3, and not in a fun way, but as time went on, it became a really close race. So when it came time for the PlayStation 4 and the not Xbox 720 to release, there was a new console war brewing. This era had even more cross-console games that people were buying, so most people were just gonna buy whatever console they had last time. However, for people who were thinking about switching, the biggest factor that made their decision were the exclusives. At this point, Sony was still actively trying with their older titles. Uncharted got a few more games that wrapped up the story they were telling, there was Little Big Planet 3 that tried something new, Last of Us got a part 2 that was just as devastating as the first, and there was even a new Ratchet Clank. Me for wanting a new Jak and Daxter, but this was still nice. So, to give them credit, they did make exclusive games. But nothing was big enough to be considered a mascot. They saw how well The Last of Us was received, and they dove that direction at an unreasonable pace, making way more new series that all lean that cinematic direction. Spider-Man was awesome, but it can't really count since he's Spider-Man. Ghost of Tsushima was not only an incredible game, but it also had the runner-up for a potential mascot. Horizon Zero Dawn is a game that I played for a total of 48 minutes, but I've heard it's fine. It got a Lego game, so it better be. But there was really no contest because the frontrunner for this generation was Kratos, who was back, but far less angry. God of War started on the PS2 and got a reboot with the appropriately titled God of War. But this time around, they went a really different direction, making it a slower and more narratively driven experience like their other popular titles. Imagine if they tried to do that with Ratchet and Clank. I would kill someone. But by this point, it was clear that PlayStation almost abandoned the idea of having a mascot, and it worked. They had their notable IP that were doing the heavy lifting for their console sales. and they were more focused on their rolling list of games where they bring in new entries to replace the old ones once they got stale. Now that does create the issue where people like me who have been waiting for new games in our favorite series are left to, I think the term is, to go f ourselves. But the new games are still great. I like the cinematic experiences they're going for, but why does that come at the cost of not getting other kinds of games? Not every series needs a full-price AAA game. Just give us something. To be fair, we have gotten a new Ratchet Clank, and they replaced some of their more family-friendly series with games like Astrobot, which is fantastic. But the series like Sly Cooper, Infamous, and Little Big Planet get left in limbo while they focus on series like God of War and Spider-Man. So at this point, the only character that could be considered PlayStation's mascot currently is Kratos. He has been an icon since the PS2 era and has had games with multiple gameplay styles that have only gotten more popular over time. While Ratchet & Clank has been going on for longer, it's never reached that same level of success that it did back in the day. Older IPs like Crash and Spyro are releasing on every console, and many of the series that could have been a mascot have been lost to time. The only other series in the conversation at this point is Astrobot, filling the same role as Little Big Planet did for the PS3 and PS4. It's more family-friendly, and it fills that mascot role well, but when people think of PlayStation, currently their first thought goes to God of War. The fact that there's even room for interpretation on who PlayStation's mascot is the exact problem. So until further notice, I'm the mascot. PlayStation, write me a check. Finally, I just want to say thanks for watching. Now I know you might be confused, I am too, but this is my second channel where I'm gonna talk about things in a less scripted and unfiltered way. So if you like that, good. Okay, bye.